A journey through memories. The rhythmic clattering of the train wheels against the tracks was like a heartbeat, steady and comforting. Thomas leaned against the window, his breath fogging up the glass as the familiar scenery of dense forests and distant hills stretched out before him. It had been years since he last saw this place, and yet, the sight felt like a long-lost friend. The small village near the hill station, where he had spent his childhood, was finally within reach. Next stop Eldon Vale, the conductor's voice echoed through the train speaker. Eldon Vale. His village. He couldn't help the surge of excitement that washed over him. Thomas had been away for so long, chasing opportunities in the bustling city. But there was something about Eldon Vale that always tugged at his heart. The village was where everything started, where he and his friends had made memories that felt more vivid than any of the things he had experienced since. As the train approached the station, Thomas's mind wandered back to those carefree days spent running through the forests, exploring hidden paths, and making mischief with his childhood friends. The village had shaped him in ways that the city never could. It was a place full of warmth, of simple joys, and of adventures that had seemed grand at the time. The train finally came to a stop with a jolt. Thomas stepped off the platform, the cool mountain air instantly greeting him. The familiar scent of pine trees and earth filled his lungs. He took a deep breath, closing his eyes for a moment, letting the past wash over him. Everything was just as he remembered it. Thomas, a voice shouted, snapping him out of his thoughts. He turned to see a tall figure approaching with a wide grin. It was Alex, his best friend from childhood. Thomas hadn't seen him in years, but Alex's smile was still the same, full of warmth and mischief. Alex! Thomas laughed, stepping forward to embrace his old friend. It's been ages. I know, man. It feels like no time has passed at all, Alex replied, clapping Thomas on the back. So, how's the big city life treating you? Busy, chaotic, and lonely, Thomas admitted with a grin. But I'm glad to be back. Alex raised an eyebrow, a teasing glint in his eyes. Lonely, huh? You've always been a city guy. Well, let's get you reacquainted with the place, then. You still remember where to find trouble around here? Thomas chuckled. I'm sure you've kept the trouble spots warm for me. Alex grinned. Always. Come on, let's get to the house. Your parents are waiting. The walk to Thomas's childhood home was short, but every step seemed to bring back a flood of memories. The narrow path lined with trees, the small stream they used to skip rocks in, the stone bridge they had jumped off as kids, everything was just as he remembered. As they rounded a corner, Thomas's old house came into view. It was a small cottage, nestled against the edge of a hill, its red-tiled roof peeking out from behind the tall trees. The house looked the same, if a little more weathered than before. The wooden porch was still there, the swing his mother used to sit on still hanging from the beam. The place was home in a way the city could never be. Mom and Dad are inside, Alex said, noticing the look on Thomas's face. They'll be happy to see you. Thomas smiled softly. It's good to be back. After a long and heartfelt reunion with his parents, Thomas found himself sitting on the porch with Alex, enjoying a quiet evening. The sun was dipping below the hills, casting a golden glow over the village. So, what's changed around here? Thomas asked, leaning back in his chair. Not much, Alex replied with a shrug. A few new faces, a couple of new shops, but the place feels the same. Some things never change. Thomas smiled, his mind wandering back to the days when he and Alex had roamed these very hills. I remember when we used to run up this hill every afternoon, daring each other to race to the top. Alex laughed. I remember you always won. You were faster than the wind back then. Thomas shook his head. You were just too busy trying to get me to slow down. Always the cautious one. Someone had to be, Alex said with a smirk. But I guess it's a good thing you pushed me to keep up. Those were the best times, weren't they? They were, Thomas agreed quietly. I wish I could go back to those days sometimes. Alex leaned back in his chair, looking out at the hills in the distance. Maybe you can, in a way. Let's go to the school tomorrow. See if it feels like it used to. Thomas raised an eyebrow. The school? We haven't been there in years. I know, Alex said, standing up and grinning. But I think it's time for a little nostalgia. The next morning, they made their way to the school. As they walked down the familiar path, Thomas could feel the weight of memories pressing down on him. The small brick building came into view, and for a moment, it was as if no time had passed at all. It looked almost exactly the same, maybe a little more worn, but still full of life and memories. After all these years, I'm surprised they haven't torn this place down, Thomas said, his voice soft. Some things are too precious to change, Alex said, nudging him. Besides, this is where we became who we are. They stood at the gates for a moment, looking at the place where they had spent countless hours laughing, learning, and causing trouble. Remember when we used to sneak into the art room? Thomas said with a grin. We'd use all the paint supplies just to make the worst masterpieces. Alex chuckled. I think our teacher nearly had a heart attack when she saw the mess we made. They both laughed, their voices carrying across the empty schoolyard. As they walked through the gates, it was clear that the place held more than just bricks and mortar. It held their past, their innocence, and their shared history. Inside, the classrooms were quieter than they remembered, but the smell of chalk and wood was still the same. They peeked into their old classroom, and Thomas's heart skipped a beat. The desks were still arranged the way they had been, as though the years hadn't passed at all. He could almost hear the chatter of the students, the scrape of chairs, and the voice of their teacher, Mrs. Turner. Do you ever think about the future? Alex asked, breaking the silence. Thomas turned to him, a little surprised by the question. The future? Yeah. Like, where we'll be in another 10 years. Will we still be coming back here, remembering the good old days? Thomas thought about it for a moment. I don't know. But maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe it's enough to know that this place shaped us. That we had these moments together. Alex smiled, a hint of sadness in his eyes. Yeah. Maybe that's all we need. They spent the rest of the day walking around the village, revisiting all their favorite spots. The old oak tree where they had carved their initials, the riverbank where they had spent hours fishing, and the small hill where they had watched sunsets for as long as they could remember. By the time the evening rolled around, Thomas felt at peace. The village, the memories, the friends, it was all still here, woven into the very fabric of the place. He realized that, though time had moved on, there were some things that would never change. As the sun set behind the hills, casting a warm glow over Eldon Vale, Thomas knew he'd carry this place with him, no matter where life took him next. Thanks for today, Alex, Thomas said as they sat on the porch of his old house, the last rays of the sun painting the sky. Anytime, man. It's good to remember where we came from, Alex replied, his voice full of contentment. And as the night descended, the two of them sat in companionable silence, knowing that some things, like friendship and the memories of home, would always endure.